Namaste and welcome to today's episode of Bharat Varta. Today's guest is a distinctive and unique personality who has been in leadership roles in the private sector as well as in the government. He has run some of the largest infrastructure projects in the country and is a foremost expert in the country when it comes to this infrastructure industry. Welcome, Mr. Shailesh Pathak, and thank you for talking to us today.
Thank you.
Before we get into the questions, I should tell our audience about the remarkable career Mr. Pathak has had. He's currently the CEO of L&T Infra Development Projects and has in the past worked in leadership roles with firms like SRE, EI, IDFC, and ICICI. He served the Indian Administrative Service for 16 years, running projects to build roads, power plants, tiger habitats, and dams, notably projects linked to the Sardar Sarovar Dam. He's also an alumnus of IIM Calcutta. So quite a long and very distinguished introduction, and we are really happy to have you here. Okay, let's start with overview of Indian infrastructure. What do you see are the top 3-4 features or issues that we encounter today in India when it comes to the infrastructure sector?
So I'd say that would be, and here I'd only focus on physical infrastructure, because infrastructure can be physical, it can be social, education, health, it can be digital, and it can be others. But within physical infrastructure, there is transport and there is energy, and then there's urban and everything else broadly. So within transport, energy, and urban, I would say the biggest challenge in India is actually how to construct at speed and at scale. 70% of India is yet to be built, and this will happen in the next 10 to 20 years. We have seen a rapid increase in the speed and scale of projects, but there is headroom to do this better. Aligned to this is actually contracts and contract management and construction contract management. So I'll talk about that at greater detail. The third point that emerges out of the second is dispute resolution. Much of the slow speed is because we cannot resolve disputes very quickly. And sometimes court cases also come into the way. And maybe, access to inputs, including right of way, is an issue. So if I can start by sharing some content, whenever you enable participant screen sharing, I will talk about how our company, Larsen & Toubro, it's a very large company. My company is a very small part of it. Larsen & Toubro built a light rail transit 13-kilometer stretch from concept to commissioning in 2 years. 2 years.
Right.
Why can't we do it in India? So I ran a Twitter poll, and I'll talk about it later. And maybe financing, while it is talked about much more, financing is available for the right projects is what our experience has been. And therefore, I would like to put financing as at the end of the 3 or 4 priorities that we spoke about. So just to repeat, speedy construction, contract management, dispute resolution, access to inputs, including right of way, and financing. Thanks.
Okay, that's very interesting because the general notion is that it's the financing part which is difficult, but I think you give a different perspective to this this whole concept. What are some of these global best practices that we can use in India? Like you mentioned, you've built like a speedy project elsewhere, but how do we learn from that in India?
So these comments are in personal capacity, but I'll say that Larsen & Toubro operates in 30 countries.
Right.
And in many of those countries, we build very, very quickly. So if you look at the project life cycle of infrastructure projects, there is essentially a design phase in which we decide what to do. And that is decided usually by the government, right?
Right.
Once it is decided, the design phase comes up with specific blueprints and drawings and detailed project reports. Then the search for financing happens, because without money, you're not going to build it. And once the design is ready and the financing happens, then the bids are invited for construction. So the procurement cycle happens. Once the successful bidder has been given the letter of intent and the notice to proceed, actual construction happens.
Right.
And of course, after construction, the operations phase happens. So typically, I always keep this with me to remind ourselves that the man wearing these safety jackets is the man constructing our infrastructure and operating our infrastructure. So activities wearing this are fairly predictable. So making a metro in Pune and in Paris or in Shanghai are pretty much the same activity. But it is the pre-construction activities before wearing this jacket that take too long in India.
Right.
And then you have, I'll start with the story here. One of my good friends was in the Embassy of India in Japan, in Tokyo. And we had a new building to be built for the Indian embassy in Tokyo. And it was awarded after whatever process. And the time given was some 2 years and 6 months. So that's, 24, 30 months. At the end of the 20th month, not one thing had happened on the site. And, we in India, if for 20 months nothing happens on site, we'll hit panic buttons. And our colleagues reached out to the construction contractor. They said, we are planning to the last detail how we are going to build this. And you don't worry, you'll get it in 30 months. So sometime around the 22nd month, they started construction. In the 29th month, they handed over the building fully completed. So, what we do typically is we do some Bhumi Puja. We put foundation stone in the second month, and then for 7 months, nothing happens. And then suddenly some flurry of activity. So maybe this is a way to design our programs better and design our construction schedules better. I was at a large power plant being built by our L&T Power construction people. And I said, what's your key concern? They said, we have around 1050 acres. Everything within this is in our control. But the trucks that are carrying our inputs, they are taking unduly long because some bridges on the way have been declared slightly weak and therefore heavy traffic is not being permitted. So what we had assumed would be delivered to us in 2 months is now taking 6 months. So in construction, there are many such imponderables and factors.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I think to the lay audience, sometimes these things are not very visible. What we see is the progress on the ground, but then what happens behind that and how things can go wrong in different ways. I think that appreciation probably is not there to the general observer. Okay, so within India, what are the different models adopted by the various states which tend to work? We spoke about what doesn't work or what can go wrong, but then what goes right? And is there something which, is there knowledge which can be transferred from one state to another state? Can states learn from each other?
In fact, there are so many success stories. Thank you, Ashish, for that question. There are so many success stories within India that can be replicated and rolled out elsewhere. And different states have had different success stories and some failure stories also. So let's focus on the successes. I think the Mumbai-Pune Expressway, when it was constructed, was a great success story. I'm happy to share the details as related by Mr. Nitin Gadkari. I think the electrification and three-phase constant water power supply in Gujarat is an amazing success story. As Chief Minister, Mr. Modi drove that, and now it has been replicated on the national level. The expressway model of UP, now they have constructed various expressways after the first Yamuna. That's a very good success model. The urban governance of Tamil Nadu is an excellent success story. So you have different stories coming out of, I would say, Madhya Pradesh. Madhya Pradesh, the way it has upgraded city infrastructure, and I've spent 16 years of my life in Madhya Pradesh. the way Indore and Bhopal have just shot up in the national rankings is an amazing success story. So I'd say there are various lessons to be learned. We can go into individual cases, but I would just like to refer to the national level rankings in various ways that are leading to virtuous competition. So as you know, 3 days ago, we released the 2020 report for the municipal index and the ease of living for cities. Now that's 111 cities across India. And you can go to the dashboard and check out your own city, all the viewers. And next time that the ranking happens, your local citizenry, civil society, media can actually propel more change so that your ranking goes up.
Right. No, in fact, that's quite interesting. Obviously, I follow the Indore progress quite closely, and in fact, just today morning on another show of Bharat Vada, we were talking about the same thing, that how some cities have really upped their ante, right, and they've taken this in a very positive way. But having said that, we do realize that while we build roads, etc., or metros in cities, the last mile infrastructure seems to be a big issue, right? Like end of the day, it appears that we are creating infrastructure which is not integrated. You can have metro, you can have buses, you can have trains, but they don't seem to be linking to each other. We don't seem to be getting that Western experience when all of this comes up, right? So where is the gap there? Why do we have a gap on the city last mile infra?
All right, so there are two parts to this, Ashish. The first is that our cities are growing at speeds that were witnessed in European cities in the 19th century, really, and in American cities. So I did an analysis of how UK urbanized and how India is urbanizing today. And we are in the phase where London was booming between 1800 to 1850 to 1900. Now London is not attracting so many people. Yeah? But every Indian city is attracting so many people. And unlike other countries, we don't have restrictions on how many rural people can go into a city. So whatever we plan for, if a city grows by a quarter in 10 years, you've got, sorry. If a city grows by a quarter in 10 years, you're going to have problems. Now, most of your viewers, the city that they grew up and went to school in India, today's city would be double the size of when they were in school. And by 2030, believe me, the current size of the city will double, whichever city you are in India. So when you have such levels of urbanization and rapid increase in your population, there will be issues. So that's the first. The second is that apart from linear infrastructure, almost everything is urban infrastructure. So what are the non-urban infrastructure things here? Let's say pipelines are non-urban, railways are non-urban, airports are urban. Airports are connecting city to city. Roads, highways are non-urban. Again, they're connecting large cities. So where we definitely need to get our act together in India is how to run our cities better. And to that extent, if you look at any global rankings of cities, Indian cities don't even make the first 100. Exactly. It is within India that we are looking at this municipal performance index. And it's comparatively simpler to build a highway between, let us say, Bangalore and Chennai. It's comparatively simpler to build a dedicated freight corridor between Amritsar and Kolkata. It is very difficult to build up infrastructure in cities, largely because you're retrofitting. And whenever you do townships on the periphery, there are challenges around planning. Here again, there are various state models. So a state like Uttar Pradesh has a better model, let us say, than a state like Bihar. Because in a Kanpur Development Authority or a Lucknow Development Authority, you will actually have planned expansion of the city. But in a place like Patna or Muzaffarpur, that planned expansion does not happen. We can talk much longer about cities.
No, actually, it would be good to hear from you some of your experiences on this count, because you were kind of at the forefront of some of it.
I've been associated with city development, both in the government as well as in the non-government sector. And the single lesson is that greenfield cities do not work. Because people go to cities primarily for livelihoods. And you may want to develop a greenfield city, but until the livelihood question is taken care of, why would anyone go there? And a lot of these cities are vanity cities or new capitals that take time to attain scale. But what does happen is that outskirts get urbanized of existing cities. So if you look at India, we have 53 million plus cities, 10 lakh se zyada million plus population. These 53 cities are definitely going to double in size by 2030. Yeah? Then we have actually a terrible part of tier 2 cities, which are actually not very well served in urban facilities. And I'd say it's not attracting the attention it deserves, tier 2 cities. If I asked you guys to think of what are the critical elements in a city, you'd probably say livelihoods is number one. Where do you stay? Housing is number two. How do you get to your livelihood? Transport is number three. Once you have all this, then you want to bring your family to the city. So safety and security is number four. For your children, school health, school education and health, and maybe leisure and other activities. So are we really looking at this in a comprehensive manner in most cities in India? The answer is no. So in 2000, I spent some time in the US studying infrastructure and governance of cities as an Eisenhower Fellow. And I realized that the city of San Jose had a budget that was thicker than the budget at that time of Mumbai. And the capacity that cities have to run themselves in American or European cities far exceeds the capacity that we have been able to build up so far in most Indian cities. And when I looked closer, I realized that while you have two-term chief ministers and two-term prime ministers in India, you do not have two-term mayors. So younger and smarter people should tell me why that is so.
No, I guess partly it's a political problem also, right? Like that's how it's been designed. And I mean, rules also vary by different states, right? Like in some cases, and of course, mayors are also not empowered. Even if they are there, they are they don't have any legislative authority. So would you say is that the main reason or main structural change which is needed to improve the city infrastructure?
So let me give you this real life example. What happens is that a mayor in any Indian city is not going to be eligible to run for re-election.
Right.
If that happened to the chief minister or that happened to the prime minister, people would suddenly say this is very, very unfair. That if you've been a very good chief minister, you cannot run for election again. I mean, that's absurd, right? But this principle is accepted for mayors and it is accepted for district panchayats. And very few people actually know why this is so. There is a provision in Article 243T, T for Tata, of the Indian Constitution that says that for urban elections, there shall be rotation of wards for reservation. So effectively, if you're a great lady mayor belonging to the scheduled tribe community and you've done a fantastic job, you would not be eligible to run for the next election because the reservation will change to something else. So the political incentive compatibility for elected leaders to do their best as mayors is just not there. So typically what happens is your cities, our cities, are run by municipal commissioners. And these municipal commissioners have been appointed by the state government. And they would actually like to go back to that state government as soon as possible. So there is no ownership of governance of a city. And what does happen is sometimes you get a wonderful officer and you get a very enlightened mayor. And through a strange concatenation of circumstances, you have 3 or 4 years of very good governance. But then that officer moves and a new person comes, this elected leader moves, and suddenly, things slip. Whereas, again, in India, there are states that have a far better established system of political leaders championing cities. So in a West Bengal, there is political continuity of the city champion or the rural area champion. And some states like Madhya Pradesh like Maharashtra, went in for a directly elected 5-year term of a mayor. That didn't last too long because the mayor started becoming more powerful compared to the member of parliament and the member of the legislative assembly. And they got together and made sure that the mayor was defanged. So in my book, if there's one thing that we need to do to get our cities better, it is to have local champions of cities who are political, not administrative. In the recent past, we've had the coronavirus outbreak across the globe. A lot of the European and American, and indeed Asian, ASEAN countries, the response was actually articulated by the political leadership, saying, we will do this in our city. Andrew Cuomo of New York is a great example. Who was the counterpart for any Indian city on a political level? No.
Right. Absolutely. No, I think, and now that you say it, it kind of resonates that bulk of our response, even in the pandemic, was all coming from the administrative side, very little political participation. Even if it was there, it was largely more a marketing or a data dissemination exercise, not so much a, exercise in making decisions. So yes, absolutely. So what is the, how do we change this? I mean, what is there something which the central government can do or the state governments can do to make the city issues better? What is their role in this process?
I'd say that the role of the union government in this is more catalytic than anything else. Mm-hmm. Because under the 7th schedule, cities and urban governance are squarely a matter of the states. And in this case particularly, enlightened states are empowering cities. Others are not, because they think that cities are to be controlled by the state government. So there's this famous case of a chief minister from an urbanized state going to a meeting in Delhi and coming out fuming and saying, these people in the government of India are treating us chief ministers the way we treat our municipal corporations. That's the answer.
Right. No, absolutely. I do remember, I think you had written about this topic in Business Standard. I don't remember the year, but I think it was 3 or 4 years ago, you had written an article on this, right?
That's right.
Yeah. Right. Correct. I'll try and link that article to the in the YouTube description so that people can go through that particular point of view. I don't know if you remember now that you spoke about it. So,
in fact, since we are talking about this, that article also talked about how young people cannot rise up the political ecosystem, and this is the reason why dynastic rule is taking over as MLAs and MPs, because you don't have good people rising up the system and contributing. So in a northern neighbor, for instance, I know in a large northern neighbor, the practice is that if you've been a very, very good mayor of a city, that is how you rise up to the top in the national capital.
Right.
Here, I have not heard of too many good mayors of cities rising up to be chief ministers and prime ministers.
Right. Absolutely. And since the wards get reserved or de-reserved by rotation, practically the strong person there would have someone from his or her family taking up the seat next time, right? So it all stays within the family. Absolutely. Right. So another issue we see is that it seems that our cities are designed by engineers for engineers, right? So like it doesn't seem like the user part of it is really kept in mind when the design is being made. So like creating amenities like walkways or cycle paths. I mean, we talk about it, it's probably done also, but it's not very useful. It doesn't seem to have the human factors design part kind of factored in. So how do we change that for the cities?
Actually, that is perhaps the inequity challenge that our cities have. We are talking in a language that not even 10% of any Indian city understands. But unfortunately, most city design is for the people who drive in cars, right?
Right.
And designing cities for people who don't know English, who don't drive in cars, designing cities which are women friendly, child friendly, that is not really being practiced a lot. Although things are changing in the last 5 years, I've seen some change. But how could we do this? I mean, let's take a simple example of urban transport. Now, within our urban transport planning, the National Urban Transport Policy says 4 words: move people, not vehicles, right? And yet, when a city like Delhi moves people and not vehicles in a bus rapid transit system, it is designed to fail. And there is so much opposition that the BRT lanes are wound up.
Right.
In the metro space, we are, you referred to this earlier, our transport hubs are not coordinated. In a decent city like, let us say, Seoul, we can actually get off at the airport, take an elevator and go down to the train station, take another elevator and go down to the bus station.
Right.
Why should not that be a planned transport hub in Indian cities? And there are some success stories. So the Mussoorie Dehradun Development Authority has a wonderful ISBT, Interstate Bus Terminal. Our planning for multimodal urban transport hubs is going on. But this should have been done 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And how do you, simple example, next time you go to the airport or you go to the railway station, if you're in a taxi, the taxi has to pay special charge. If you're in a private car, you don't have to pay. It should be the other way.
Right.
You should be encouraged to use the taxi. And the lane that the taxi deposits you is not the closest. The private car gets off in the closest lane to the entrance. These are small things that indicate that one more point on flyovers. I've been in Asian capitals and Asian cities, which are not the top 2 cities in the country, where there is a walkway for pedestrians and cyclists beneath the flyover so that you never are in contact with 4-wheel traffic. But in India, we believe that expanding road width is the solution to our traffic problems. There's an old saying that, increasing road width and expecting traffic problems to go away is like loosening your belt and expecting your fat to melt away.
No, absolutely. That sort of hits the nail on the head. So you also mentioned earlier about the 2 types of projects, right? Like, is it that we are good at doing some parts and we are not good at doing some other parts? Do you see a distinction there, or do you see some capability evolving in either areas?
So let me say this. There are linear projects like highways or railways or transmission lines or gas pipelines or oil pipelines. Then there are large spatial projects such as a power plant or an urban township. And then there are integrated projects within an urban setting. In the degree of difficulty, acquiring land for the linear projects is probably the simplest, because you're looking at a 100-meter right of way in which you'll carry your highway or railway line or pipeline. Acquiring a large a piece of land, let's say a 500 acre, 1000 acre, is comparatively more difficult. But once you have acquired that land, then implementing within that land is a very controlled implementation issue, as long as you get your inputs on time. Perhaps the most difficult is an urban renewal. So let's give you the example of planning an urban district around a large railway station in a city. Now, most European cities, the railway station is the hub of all economic activity. The square mile around the railway station is where the most expensive real estate is, the most economic activity happens. In India, it's the opposite. The square mile around the railway station is perhaps the most productive yet unrealized and unutilized area. So if you do a urban renewal project around the railway station, smart city around the railway station, that is probably going to be the most. Let me give you real life examples. In Delhi, for instance, the G20 is going to be held in 2023, the group of 20 nations. And that's going to be held in a new international convention center that's being built in Dwarka by Larsen and Toubro. And it'll be built well in time for the G20. It'll be a world-class structure. Now, this is comparatively simple because you don't have so many other moving parts. But let us look at another project in Delhi, which is the Chandni Chowk pedestrianization and upgrading. There you have so many stakeholders working at cross purposes that some very, very bright young officers have done a good job to take all of them on board and make this happen. Let's give you another example from Indore. Indore was not such a wonderful city maybe 20 years ago, but the way the community has come together and just transformed the sanitation landscape and the governance landscape is a phenomenal success. So I would say those are more difficult than building a power plant, building a high-speed rail, building a community center.
Right, interesting. Okay, so let's look at the other part. So we spoke about the problems and the kind of projects which are there, but let's look at the construction part itself, right? Like we speak about rapid construction, but several projects are routinely delayed in India. So what needs to be done to change that? Like, what are the few things that need to be in place so that we actually realize the rapidity of the construction process?
So this is the time to share my Twitter poll. Yeah.
You can share on the screen. I think it should be enabled now.
Let me share that. Okay. So this was in 2019. Can you see it on the screen?
Yes.
Right. So this was the 13-kilometer light rail transit project.
Right.
And then I asked people, why doesn't this happen in India? The biggest was public interest litigations and delay in court cases. These remarks are personal, but everybody in the corporate sector, everybody in the construction sector is suffering from lack of speedy justice, and dispute resolution. The second, as you can see, is right of way. But this is not as much of a problem now as it was earlier, because much of the controversy around right of way and land was how land was being acquired by the government for public purpose and then being given to private benefit. And that is no longer the situation. So the controversy around land acquisition has gone down. Also, the price paid for land has gone up much better. The third is, of course, delayed government approvals. And this is also during the construction phase, which I call the contract management phase. It's also due to our not following global models like FIDIC contracts. And this is perhaps the most important. If there is a plan to complete a highway in 910 days, it assumes that cash flow is going to be absolutely regular, because that is going to push back the schedule of implementation. We have so many success stories, and not just by L&T, by so many other companies. But let me just talk about Hyderabad Metro. Hyderabad Metro is the second largest operating metro network in India.
Correct.
And we are talking about monetization for a global patient capital pension fund. This is perhaps the best investment in India today, because it's going to ride the success of Hyderabad as a city. All the construction is done, all the risk is taken out, and now it's about operational excellence and monetizing the land. So I think these kind of assets can be monetized and put back into fresh construction.
So that brings to that brings me to another point on privatization. Oh, sorry, the private player participating in the process of infrastructure creation, right? I mean, Hyderabad is a great example. Uh, I mean, why does this not work in many cases? I mean, that seems like a rare example of success, but more often than not, we see disputes even after several years, right? Like for airports and so on. So, what needs to be done there to make private participation more encouraging?
So here, let me just divide it into three parts. One is, infrastructure is very good for everything else, right?
Mhm.
If you have a dedicated freight corridor, it is not only good for the people who built the DFC, it is good for every single person shipping goods from the western sector to the northern sector, right? So it does not matter for the person sending the container from, let's say, Thane to Amritsar, whether the DFC was built by the private sector or the government sector. Similarly, it does not matter if quality of service is the same, whether your phone is a BSNL phone or an Airtel phone. So infrastructure makes things easy for everyone else, does not matter who provides that infrastructure. The second is that infrastructure has, in terms of risk profiles, an under construction risk profile and a post cash flow risk profile. Yeah. So in specific terms, Navi Mumbai Airport is coming up. Noida International Airport at Jewar is coming up in Mumbai and Delhi respectively. That has a very different risk profile than the completed T2 terminal in Mumbai or the completed T3 airport in Delhi. And there are different capital providers for these two kinds. I call these caterpillars turning into butterflies. All of us learned in biology that caterpillars grow into butterflies subsequently, but caterpillars are ugly to look at. Butterflies are very pretty. Similarly, under construction projects are full of risk, not very nice to look at. But once it's completed, it looks so nice and the cash flows keep coming in. So maybe the mistake that India made was involving the private sector in the caterpillar stage and not in the butterfly stage. We pushed for construction PPPs, not operation PPPs.
Right.
Right. And if you really go back long enough, the Indian railways are a public-private partnership because from 1860 to 1890, most of the railway network was rolled out. How was it rolled out? We called it the guaranteed railways, where we said, the government at that time said that we will give you right of way and we will give you 5% return on capital.
Yeah.
Whatever you put in, we will give you 5% return on that. And lo and behold, in 30 years, most of the railway network was built. Of course, the incentive was to maximize your project cost so that your return of 5% also goes up. So that was controversial. And 5% itself was a very high return in those days.
Right.
So there was heated debate in the UK Parliament, in the British Parliament, saying this is a sellout and these railways are being too expensive. So PPPs will normally for construction lead to such debates. However, once they are constructed, operating is always going to be better, maintaining and operating is always going to be better by the private sector. So the current thinking of the government and the union budget makes it very clear that assets will be monetized. And I'm particularly happy because in around 2010, I had been asked by the then cabinet secretary to give some suggestions on what could be done better in private participation. And I had actually shared a note with the cabinet secretary, which I shared with other chief ministers and officials across India. So this was called Recalibrating the PPP Strategy. This was published as a working paper by Stanford University in 2011. And the simple point I was making was that that give out existing public assets over to private operations and maintenance and take on new build by government. So this was the very simple construct. And I'm happy to see that this is happening now. We did make the mistake of encouraging too many PPPs in the construction stage, so much so that in 2012, there was an article in The Economist called RIPPP, right? And there, both the current Additional Secretary, Department of Economic Affairs, Mr. Rajaraman, and I had been quoted as saying that this is sometime in 2012, November, that the state should build things using private contractors. It should then sell the right to operate completed and thus lower risk projects to the private sector, raising funds to provide for more construction. Right. And this makes sense because the risk profile is the highest during construction. This is December 2012. And once the cash flow stage comes, then the risk profile changes. And this is a virtuous cycle. So you, in any case, 100% of Indian infrastructure is built by private contractors. It is about who's paying the contractor. Is it my company as a concessionaire, or is it the government authority? Right. And typically, from the last 3 years, we have seen how 2 TOT bundles have generated 14,780 crores for the NHAI. Right. And this is just the beginning. NHAI is going in for an InvIT. I must share here that our company promoted an InvIT in Infrastructure Investment Trust in May 2018. And I'm very happy to say that 92% is patient long-term capital, 15% from us and 3 very, very marquee global investors. Right. Ever since May 2018, our InvIT, a lot of other InvITs have started. So this asset monetization and asset recycling is perhaps the way to go going forward.
Right. In fact, the Prime Minister spoke about this very vividly in the last couple of weeks on how they plan to look at the CPSE asset monetization, right? Of the
That's right. That's right.
So,
there are 2 aspects. One is assets and one is companies.
Right.
And the national monetization pipeline is talking about 100 companies generating 2.5 lakh crore, correct, which is eminently possible. I mean, you have such good people in these good government companies. It is just that the 5 C's do not allow them to flourish at potential. Otherwise, they are world-class any day.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So the other pipeline that we talk about is the national infrastructure pipeline, right? Where the finance minister last year released this report of saying investment of 120 lakh crores to be made in the next 5 years. So how do you assess that? I mean, is that realistic? Can we fund it? Can we execute it? More importantly.
So I'll come back to my first answer. You know, I have looked at the national infrastructure pipeline. Our team has done a detailed analysis of individual projects. And I just hope that around 7,400 projects, 1 lakh crores or whatever it is, quite frankly, even if it is not 1 lakh crore and even if it is 10 lakh crore, can we do it in the next 2 to 3 years is the question. And we in the private sector are not so focused on what will happen 5 years later. We have bottom lines for the current year. So what can we do in the next 18 to 24 months is the question. And all of us know that putting a large infrastructure project, the project preparation takes at least 6 to 12 months. So I would very much like to suggest that now we should talk about 6 monthly bidding calendars. Right. So 7,400 is, 130,000 foot perspective. We need helicopter views. So we are in March of 2021. By October of 2021, which are the projects that are coming up for bid? Let's talk about those. And in October 2021, let's talk about the next 6 months and so on and so forth. So we have to fold in the future so that we can make the future happen. And that's what I'd say about the national infrastructure pipeline. It's a very good step that we have a project pipeline to talk about. But then we have other best practices like the Brazilian BNDES, which actually gives 6 monthly bidding calendar projects. That's what we'd like to see.
Right, exactly. So again, I'll go back to the first thing you mentioned, the very first point when you talked about the 4 issues or concerns. Would you say that financing is less important than execution? I mean, how do you rate execution versus funding or financing of a project?
I would say without financing, there is no execution because you have to pay for whatever is being built. But financing is an easier problem to solve, in my view, than the miscellaneous problems that we have in execution. For instance, I'll give you a real life example. Very often the execution problem is also about a local gundagiri problem,
Right.
right? So we run this road between Ahmedabad, Dhangadra, Malia, and there is a rail over bridge that has been taking time. And unnecessarily 6 months elapsed, and we actually went and stood there on the spot. And there was a local hoodlum who's insisting on some payoffs before foundations can be dug. So what happens? I mean, these are things that normally slip between the cracks. And this is a problem that happens in a lot of infrastructure construction across Indian states. Coming back to your question about what is important financing execution. You see, typically financing is almost always on the basis of the revenues of the state, the revenue of the state with the capital, so the government. If the government can raise more money, it can finance more infrastructure. It can finance more health facilities, more schools. And to a large extent, what has happened in the last few years is that from an informal economy, we are moving to a formal economy. And when you have a formal economy, the tax revenue base automatically goes up. GST is a great example, right? And suddenly you have much more money to deploy in such infrastructure. Let me go back around 20 years, 1998 or 99, Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee came up with the concept of actually 3 concepts which have transformed the nation. The first was the Golden Quadrilateral, the GQ connecting 4-lane roads between Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, and Kolkata. The second was the Pradhan Mantri Rural Roads scheme, the Gram Sadak Yojana. And the third was the new telecom policy giving revenue share. Each of these has transformed India in terms of highway development, in terms of rural connectivity, and in terms of mobile connectivity. When he launched this NH National Highway Program, I remember a columnist based out of Mumbai saying that this is complete bunkum. This is Mungeri Lal ke Haseen Sapne. Thankfully, she is proved wrong in her prediction. And thankfully, we have a completely different scenario of highways today in the country than we had. And a large part of this is because financing was made available with a 1 rupee cess on fuel. Right? Part of that cess went to the national highways, part of that went to the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana. So similarly, when the state generates revenue, automatically we will be able to find money for infrastructure. Let's take the example of railways. I think one of the outstanding achievements of the Indian Railways is that they have ensured that no unmanned level crossings are there in India in 2021. So somewhere 600 people were dying about 5 years ago. Not a single death has happened this year. They found the money. So in terms of the way India is growing, in terms of its GDP, in terms of its growth potential, I feel that raising the money is going to be easier than spending the money at time and in scale.
Right. Interesting. So, before we end, I would like to have 2 questions. One is, of course, on if you can share your personal experiences from the Sardar Sarovar Dam project, because you've spoken about it multiple times. You had responded to one of my Twitter threads several years ago on your experience of going into the villages, and that would be really useful. And I'll come back to the last question once we are done with this.
Sure. So when I was a much younger person, we're talking about what, 1993. I was a subdivisional magistrate and land acquisition officer and rehabilitation officer for the oustees of the Sardar Sarovar Dam in the first 11 villages that were going to be partially submerged. And, it's a very different country today, but in those days, the standard slogan was, "Koi nahi hatega, bandh nahi banega." And the 11 villages that we had, they were not accessible by road. And these were villages basically on the banks of the Narmada on the hill.
Right.
And during the monsoon, when the Narmada was in spate, the families would just move up the hill. They had no access to any healthcare. They had no electricity. And they were essentially into subsistence existence. And they were offered this move to rehabilitation sites, which were just 15 kilometers away, so that they would not lose connection in their social ecosystem. You don't want to uproot a family and completely. So it was their aspiration to move to a better lifestyle. And when we went into those villages, typically you had to walk from the last place the vehicles would go. You had to walk a minimum of 3 hours and a maximum of 7 hours to get to these villages. And it was their aspiration for a better lifestyle. But activism of whatever sort said that, no, these people must continue their lives the way they are. And we were saying, give them a choice. If they choose to continue their lifestyle, it's their choice. But if they don't, it is their choice to move. And finally, when, after a lot of site visits and a lot of friction with the activists, when the villagers said that, yes, we want to relocate, and we put all those trucks to pick up their household effects and move to the rehabilitation sites, we were given physical threats by the activists. So sometimes I wonder, whenever you do infrastructure, you must listen to all stakeholders. But once the decision has been taken after consultation with stakeholders, then execution has to take over. Then at every small pretext, PILs cannot hinder projects. And that perhaps is the big weakness that we in India have today.
Right. No, I think that's a fascinating story. I mean, I'll also link the Twitter conversation we had on this, some of the documents which you had alluded to in that thread. So I'll try and link that to the YouTube channel video as well. Okay. So before we end, one last question on, so how do you see the Indian infrastructure scenario evolving in the next decade? Pluses, minuses?
So I'll just say that we will see more change in the next 10 years than we have seen in the last 20.
Okay.
Right.
That's fascinating, because we haven't actually, I mean, even though last 5-6 years or 10 years have been pretty good on various aspects, we still haven't seen as much as we would need. We always seem to be catching up, especially in the cities, right? So that sounds very encouraging.
So let me spell out why I'm saying this. The trunk infrastructure will be built. What do I mean by trunk infrastructure? The way President Eisenhower built the interstates in the US between, let's say, 1956 and 1965, our expressways will get built in the next 5 to 6 years. They will get built. Our 6 lanes and 4 lanes are already there. Whatever is now going to be built substantially is access controlled greenfield expressways. So that will be built in the next 6 years. Our national rail plan is worth looking at. That national rail plan is talking about from now till 2030, so that we have a system for the next 30 years. In terms of dedicated freight corridor, people do not realize how dramatically it's going to change logistics in India. And that a lot of it is being built by my company. That is going to transform logistics between Amritsar on the western sector and on the eastern sector, the eastern and the western dedicated freight corridor. High-speed rail between Ahmedabad and Mumbai will get built with a little hiccup here and there. Once that is built, the next stage of high-speed rail is going to be rolled out by 2031. And that's part of the national rail plan. And what we need in India is a good success story. So since we are IIM Calcutta here, when I went to Calcutta in 1984, I saw the Calcutta Metro, and that never really became a role model for other cities. It is after the Delhi Metro success that metros were replicated across Indian cities. It is after the dedicated freight corridor success that similar corridors will happen at least in 3 other areas. The high-speed rail will happen in other areas. And the level of aspiration of Indians is going to rise so sharply that actually politics and governance will respond by providing better infrastructure. Lastly, as I said, if you have the money, you can do it. I see revenue buoyancy. I see the state able to collect much more revenue from the economic development that is going to happen over the next 10 years. If at all there is a doubt, it is about whether our cities can respond and become competitive. To that extent, the Municipal Performance Index and the Ease of Living Index should lead to a virtuous cycle. Thanks.
Well, that was very comprehensive and very optimistic. Typically on Bharat Varta, all our discussions end on optimistic note, and this one is no different. Thank you so much, Mr. Pathak, for joining us. Fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashish. Bye then.
Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Bharat Varta podcast. If you want to see more content like this, then don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We started Bharat Varta to facilitate long-form discussions on politics, policy, and culture. We don't necessarily endorse anything that was said in this episode. If you wish to offer us feedback, do reach out to us on social media. We are at Bharat Varta on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You could also get in touch with us on our website, www.bharatvarta.in. The links are in the description below. Until next time, stay safe, take care, and Jai Hind.